Hi everyone, welcome back to Web3 Deep Dive Podcast. I'm so excited for today's interview. Today I'll be speaking with Muneeb Ali. He is the co-founder of Stacks. Hi Muneeb, how are you?
I'm great.
Yeah, well thanks for joining us. I've been wanting to interview you forever, so I'm so happy you're here.
No, I'm so excited.
Yeah, so Muneeb, before we get started, maybe tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and about Stacks.
Yes, so Stacks is a Bitcoin L2. Like in some ways, it's sort of like the leading Bitcoin L2. The project started in 2017, and before that, I was doing my PhD in distributed systems at Princeton. So I'm an engineer at heart, and got pulled into Bitcoin around 2013. This is my 11th year now in the industry, and I think I've been a Bitcoin believer for a very long time. And I think I was one of the few voices who pushed for more developer activity in Bitcoin, like actually using Bitcoin as internet money, not just for holding, but actually building around Bitcoin. And I think in the last year and a half, that's finally starting to happen. And I think that's the thing that I'm by far the most excited about these days, that original vision for Bitcoin, which is, developers are building things with it, people are using it online actively as internet money. I think that's finally happening, and those are very exciting times.
Right. So it's interesting to see how Bitcoin has matured, and now we've gotten to this point where people are building on it. How has that evolution happened, and why are we seeing people building on it now? What's changed?
Yes, I think it's a great question, and I think it requires a little bit of a historical context. So if you go back in time, even Vitalik tried building on Bitcoin first. Right. And Bitcoin is limited by design at the base layer. And Vitalik tried proposing some changes to Bitcoin, but the Bitcoin core devs, and rightly so, they sort of are of the opinion that Bitcoin shouldn't change. It's supposed to be sound money, it's supposed to be durable, and Bitcoin should remain very simple at the base layer. And Vitalik went off and started Ethereum, right? And if you even think about all these different applications, many of them actually started on Bitcoin. Most people don't know this, but NFTs started on Bitcoin with Counterparty around 2015, 2016. Stablecoins started on Bitcoin with the Omni layer. Tether actually issued the first stablecoins on Bitcoin. Colored coins, which are sort of like the early ICOs in a way, they started on Bitcoin. So any sort of big concept that you would think about that's working in our industry right now, the roots actually go back to Bitcoin. But it was very hard to program these things on Bitcoin because Bitcoin is very limited at the base layer. And when Vitalik started Ethereum, it was not just that Ethereum was more programmable and better suited in many ways for these applications. I think there was a culture of welcoming developers as well. So I think that year, this is basically 2016, 2017, let's call it 2017, is a sort of a crucial year because two things happened. That's when Ethereum really started to gain developer attention, right? So people were trying it out and they were finding that Ethereum is much easier to program and build on than Bitcoin, right? Which is true. Secondly, Bitcoin at the same time was going through a civil war, right? Which was this big block, small block fight that was happening, and it was a pretty big deal in Bitcoin. But at the heart of it, at the crux of it, it was really about the big block people wanted to do more things at the base layer. And the small block people were basically hey, just leave Bitcoin how it is. It doesn't need to change. And I think and I was in an interesting camp. I was on the small block side, but wanted to build things, right? Because I agree that Bitcoin should stay simple at the base layer. But the difference of opinion is that most of the applications should be built as layer 2s. So that was my original stance in 2017. And I think as a result of it, because of the civil war that happened in Bitcoin, a lot of the people who actually wanted to build stuff on Bitcoin ended up going to Bitcoin Cash or other forks of Bitcoin, right? And those never really took off, right? And so Bitcoin's sort of self-sabotaged in a way in terms of building on Bitcoin, and at the same time, Ethereum was growing and welcoming everybody. The developers come here and do that. And I think because of that was a massive hit to building on Bitcoin. So since 2017 to the next couple of years, I call them sort of the dark ages of Bitcoin, right? The developers basically left and people forgot about building on Bitcoin and so on. And everyone, those are the times when people would talk about Ethereum is going to flip Bitcoin because any metric you look at, be it number of transactions, number of users, number of developers, applications. Ethereum was like thriving, and Bitcoin was sort of stabilized as this one base use case.
Right.
And I think now that is starting to change, but that historical context is like very important for understanding that I don't think there's a technological limitation. I think just historically, this is how things evolved.
I want to take this time to thank the sponsor behind Web3 Deep Dive podcast, Merlin Chain. Merlin Chain is a Bitcoin Layer 2 that integrates zero-knowledge rollup, decentralized Oracle network, and on-chain BTC fraud modules. Merlin Chain is committed to empowering Bitcoin native assets, protocols, and products on Layer 1 through its Layer 2 network to make Bitcoin fun again. Merlin Chain is a subsidiary product line of Bitmap Tech, a premier OG team boasting an overall market cap exceeding $500 million. The BRC 420 Blue Box collection under Bitmap Tech has become one of the hottest assets on ordinals. Would you say that ordinals and now runes have a big part in that history?
Absolutely. So I think basically, I would say, so it's not like nobody was building on Bitcoin during those times. Like obviously Stacks was there, Lightning is there, another Bitcoin L2 that a lot of people know about, which is focused on payments. A couple other projects like Liquid from Blockstream, they're sort of like a L2, federated but L2. So there was some development that was going on during those times, but if you just look at the just the number of developers or user activity, it's dwarfed by what was happening in the rest of crypto. Not just on Ethereum, but newer systems like Solana and Avalanche and these new things that were coming up. But at the same time, on the Bitcoin side, when Ordinals launched, because it's a L1 protocol, it impacts Bitcoin base fees, right? So people really feel the impact of it.
Right.
So Bitcoin fees actually went up by like 200x or something.
Right.
And then normal people who were using Bitcoin actually started noticing it. They're like, wait a minute, the fees are at $40. And the last time, so if you were doing a $100 transaction, it makes no sense to pay $40 in fees, right? The last time fees were this high or even higher was actually 2017. Between this time, the fees were so low that people never saw this pain point, and they would mistake Bitcoin L1 to be something that would always remain as a low fee environment. That's not how Bitcoin is designed. Any amount of user activity or traffic that would happen on the L1, Bitcoin is designed to have extremely high fees at the L1 level. Like whenever people talk about, oh, the whole world is going to use Bitcoin. Bitcoin can't even go to like 200, 300 million users at the L1. Like forget about it. A billion is impossible. A billion people can't even own like the base UTXO on the L1. So I think all the Bitcoin people, and that's another thing that happened in the culture, because most of the developers left, the technical depth of the Bitcoin community actually became very shallow. Like very few technical people remained in the Bitcoin community. So when you would see Bitcoin podcasts or Bitcoin discussions, even Bitcoin conferences, they just lack the technical knowledge to understand these things. That, hey, look, Bitcoin is not designed for use at the L1. Like it's never going to scale to that. So to these people, it was a surprise that what happened like suddenly, right? And their reaction is not to welcome these developments and be like, hey, look, developers are finally doing something, or we are seeing high fees, which is actually healthy for Bitcoin security. Their reaction is like, what is this ordinals thing? It's an attack on Bitcoin. Let's try to shut it down. And then they realize that they can't shut it down. The protocol is open. Anyone is permissionless. This is how Bitcoin is designed. So that's, I think, it started to change the conversation, because people are realizing we can't stop developers from doing these things, right? And Bitcoin fees are always going to be high, and in some ways, it's actually really good for Bitcoin security, because miners were enjoying it. Like Bitcoin miners were actually making more money, and a lot of other people were getting excited, and new developers were coming back to Bitcoin and doing fun things again, right? So it was a big cultural shift, and me and the Stacks ecosystem really actually, in some ways, like in some ways in the background, really tried helping this developer ecosystem. Because for the past 3-4 years, we were building developer communities, we were building APIs and tooling, and we sort of like came in, tried helping the Ordinals community. Some of the biggest like Ordinals wallets are actually Stacks wallets, or some of the API providers are actually like companies in the Stacks ecosystem, because Stacks is at Bitcoin L2. Like, you know, it's designed to very easily integrate with Bitcoin infrastructure. Right. So we were in a great place to help the community, not just from a developer momentum and sort of like, you know, support perspective, but with actual tooling and wallets and other things that was needed. Because in some ways, showing the world that, hey, the L1 is not where the user activity is going to be, is only going to drive more traffic to the L2s. And that naturally happened. Then people realize L2s are almost like, you know, necessary. They're not a nice to have. It's almost like they're a medicine for a big pain point that people are feeling on Bitcoin. And that's where, you know, more interest started coming to Stacks, which is sort of like the leading L2 at this point. But now there are so many others launching, and my reaction is not that, you know, I'm encouraging more people to come in and build, because I think there's so much room to grow this pie, right? Like, instead of like trying to fight over who's getting what part of the pie, I think the pie is just going to be so large that I'm encouraging anyone to come in and build L2s, build sort of like other tooling and infrastructure, because Bitcoin is like $1 trillion capital base, and not even like 0.1% of that is actively being used right now, right? Like in L2s. So Bitcoin L2s are at an extremely early stage at this point.
Right, and I mean, we're seeing an influx of them now, which I'm glad you shared your take on that, you know, that you're open and welcome to that ecosystem. Bitcoin DeFi, what are your thoughts on Bitcoin DeFi use cases?
Yes, so I think in the early days of Bitcoin, so I mentioned I started around 2013 or so. In the early days of Bitcoin, there was a very sort of like common saying that all the successful experiments in the rest of crypto would eventually come to Bitcoin, right? So people actually view things like, you know, Litecoin or other forks out there as a test bed, that let's go first and, you know, stick a bunch of things on the wall, see what sticks, what works, and when it matures enough, we will try to bring that concept to Bitcoin. And it's sort of like a joke that, you know, Ethereum was a test net, but there's something behind it, right? Like, let them go, do the experiments, do the more risky things, and once it evolves, then we will try to figure out how to do it on the mothership, right? Like, which is Bitcoin. And in some ways, I think if you look at DeFi evolution, Ethereum deserves a lot of credit for, you know, innovating there, doing the experiments, going through hacks, going through problems, and then some core DeFi primitives started to emerge, right? Some clear things that have product market fit. Like, for example, stablecoins. At this point, nobody can argue that stablecoins don't have product market fit. Like, it's one of the most widely used things in our industry. Similarly, certain DeFi primitives like, you know, lending, where people are locking ETH capital and they're taking a stablecoin loan. Very base level primitive, but it's very clear there's demand for it, right? So if people want to do that with ETH, why wouldn't they want to do that with BTC? If anything, they would want to do it more with BTC. Like, I value my Bitcoin more. I don't want to sell it. I don't want to get a tax hit by selling it. And I want to just lock it and get some liquidity as a stable coin. So I think that's a very obvious use case. And people, it surprises me that why were people skeptical of Bitcoin DeFi? Mm-hmm. To me, it's like the most natural thing. If people are doing DeFi-like things with Sol on Solana, why wouldn't they want to do the same thing with BTC, that's by far the #1 digital asset, by far the thing that has product market fit as sound money, and so many institutions and so many holders around the world actually use it, right? So the same applications would run with BTC, and that would be a much bigger market just because of how big Bitcoin is.
Right.
So that's sort of like my take on Bitcoin DeFi. And again, we're so early in Bitcoin DeFi. Just looking at the numbers, Bitcoin, $1 trillion something asset, not even 1% of that exists in a programmable form, including on Ethereum, like WBTC or other chains. Like, it's no one has tapped into that market, like not even 1%. So imagine if 10% of Bitcoin actually gets deployed in DeFi, like that's going to be huge. And once people can do that with BTC, like, it's going to be, hey, that's where all the developers are going. That's where, you know, all the capital is going, because we are all now sort of like, you know, coming to the mothership, and that's where the big game is being played.
Right.
Freedom GPT is an app store for AI.
Freedom GPT is most commonly known for its censor-free AI model called Liberty that answers literally any prompt you ask with an unbiased response. Unlike other AIs where controversial topics are off limits, Freedom GPT embraces the concept that you should be able to ask AI anything. Equally important, Freedom GPT has the option to be run locally on your computer so your data remains 100% private and secure. Check out Freedom GPT's over 80 AI models today. Well, I wish we had more time to further discuss that, but we can do a follow-up. I know that we're running low on time. You have a speaking slot, so any final thoughts for our listeners before you head out?
Yes, I think I would encourage people to look into what Stacks is doing as a Bitcoin L2. Look into other projects, that what's happening on the Bitcoin side, because I do think there's still sort of like this image from the last 4 or 5 years that Bitcoin is sort of like a pet rock and there isn't a lot of development happening. Even like very smart people in our industry, they're still not fully updated on what's happening on the Bitcoin side. And I think and what I always tell them is if the data changes, like if there's new information, you need to revisit your mental models, right? So if your mental model before was that, okay, Bitcoin is just this passive asset, no one's actually building there, and you're just focused on Ethereum, focused on Solana or whatever, I think you need to revisit your mental models and reevaluate that if building on Bitcoin is now possible, these L2s are possible, how does that impact the industry and so on. And some people, very smart people, they have good questions, right? Like they go deep on the technical side and ask about specifics of L2s and so on, but they're really good answers, right? So the answers that they were getting like 2 years ago, they might not be relevant anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think they need to look at Bitcoin building with a very fresh perspective.
Right. I mean, I know that I do, so I really appreciate this conversation. I've been a big believer in Bitcoin since 2017, and I need to, learn more about what's going on. So Muneeb, thank you.
Absolutely. No, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. I'd also like to thank the sponsors behind Web3 Deep Dive. You can click the links in the show notes to learn more about each of the Web3 initiatives from these sponsors. Finally, thanks to the listeners for tuning in. Please be sure to subscribe, like, and share. I'll see you guys next time.